afternoon, everyone.
We're delighted, as mentioned, to be joined, by Giles Duley, who, as I mentioned, is the UN Global Advocate for Persons with Disabilities in Conflict and Peace Building Situation. But I also want to flag that today is apparently your last day
Yes,
as a global advocate.
we could say former, I think.
Former, almost, yeah. I think by the end of business. I hope you didn't do anything wrong for this to be your last day. But all joking aside, Giles, thank you for everything you've done, and we look forward to hearing from you. So please go ahead. Yeah, don't worry, it's turned on. Don't worry.
Oh, it's a turn up.
Yeah, there you go.
Great. It's nice to be here. This is my final day. It was a 3-year placement as a global advocate. But I have to sit here and say that I feel like I've failed, and I feel like the system failed. You know, as an advocate, my job is to share stories, is to bring the stories from the front line where I work as a photographer in humanitarian crisis and war zones, and to bring those stories that sadly remain unheard. And yet too often, as somebody with disability, when I'm asked to give a talk or a lecture, both at the UN and with other organizations, the word that's used is inspiration. I'm asked to present an inspiring talk. But my job is not to inspire others. I'm not here as an advocate to be an inspiration for people. My job is to share stories. Because the reality on the ground for people with disabilities has not changed. People who are vulnerable, marginalized in communities, are the ones who are left behind in crises. So I feel I failed in my position here. I feel it has achieved very little because I have not had that opportunity to truly be an advocate. So on my way here, I was thinking I wanted to share 3 stories. I work as a photographer, also have my own foundation, so I spend probably 95% of my life in frontline areas listening to stories. And listening is a very key word here. Listening to what the reality is like for people with disabilities. Too often, people with disabilities are presented as inspiration, as resilient people, and of course they are. But that means the stories of those left behind who are truly vulnerable are often ignored or forgotten. We can't romanticize the idea of disability. So I chose a story from each of the 3 years while I've been here as a representative. I'm just checking the names because we've had to change the names for various reasons. These photographs are available, and a few of them are in the exhibition downstairs. The first story was one that was very personal for me, of a young boy called Amro. Amro in Gaza, I met 3 years ago. He had lost a leg when an Israeli sniper shot him during the Great March. He was treated in Turkey. He went through a very difficult time there, where he was even beaten once by one of the nurses. He returned to Gaza, traumatized by his experience, feeling marginalized by all sides, and he quite literally hid in his parents' apartment. He didn't want to go outside, having lost a leg, because he felt people would judge him. Maybe they would think he was a terrorist. Maybe they would think he was unable to do things because of his disability. He would be stigmatized. All these different things in his head played, and he had been forgotten. So when I met him for 2 years, he had not left his flat. His father I'd met, and he said, you should come and meet him, and maybe you can encourage him to leave. So I visited a few times. I'm also a chef, so I love to cook with people. That's always the first way I build relationships. So we ate, we shared a meal. And eventually I said, why don't you come outside? We're going to have a coffee somewhere along the beach in Gaza. And he was like, well, no, I don't want to. Everyone will stare at me. Everyone will look at me. And I pointed out to him, I've lost 3 limbs. I said, don't worry, they'll be looking at me, not you. I'll get more attention. So we laughed, and eventually he came out, and we had a coffee. And we did that for several times during my visit. On the last time, his family bought me a watch that they bought in the market as a gift, which I still have at home, a present, because they were so happy to see him outside. You know, and sometimes it's these very small gestures of kindness and time that can change someone's life. I won't forget, though, the messages I was getting from the family after 7th of October, asking how can we escape? Because people with disabilities, whenever there is a crisis, are the ones most vulnerable. So in this particular situation, people living on the top floors of apartment buildings, when the electricity is gone, cannot evacuate. When warnings are done by sound, people who are deaf do not get them. When people are in wheelchairs and there's rubble in the streets, they lose all accessibility. I don't know what happened to that family. The last messages I got were, how do we escape? The second story I want to share was in Chad 2 years ago. I went there to visit Sudanese refugees who had escaped mainly from Darfur and the civil war, or the fighting that's been happening in Sudan. And there was a woman called Nawali who had polio as a child, who was using a motorized wheelchair in Sudan, was a very active member of her community. She was a teacher, an activist. When her village was attacked, they smashed her wheelchair. She literally had to crawl to safety in Chad. Now, when I met her, she was in a tent with no wheelchair. No agency had provided that wheelchair. When I spoke to the UNHCR about why had she not been registered, why had nobody been aware of this, I was told it was because there were no experts to decide who had disabilities when they arrived. I pointed out that possibly somebody dragging themselves by their hands past them maybe didn't need an expert. The point being that this amazing woman who had lived a very independent life now had to crawl, quite literally drag herself, to use the toilets. Not only humiliating, but also made her incredibly vulnerable to sexual violence and other attacks. This is failure. And the third story is from Ukraine, a story from quite recent, of a young woman called Julia. Julia's family was living in an area that was occupied in the first days of the full-scale invasion by Russian forces. She has cerebral palsy. She's not able to communicate. She is bedbound and needs full support 24 hours a day by her family. Her mother is a teacher, and so the Russians took her hostage along with the father. They were tortured. The mother kept saying, I have to return home because my daughter cannot feed herself. Eventually, she was released, and she returned home to find soldiers outside the house. They looked at her, smiled sarcastically, and said, don't worry. We've been looking after her. We've been feeding her sweets. She walked in to her daughter's bedroom, her daughter who can't dress herself, to find herself naked on the bed with sweet wrappers over her. Since then, her teeth have fallen out, her hair has fallen out because she's unable to communicate what happened. But internally, the stress has made her physically sick. This is the reality for people living with disabilities in conflict situations. We cannot abandon people. We cannot forget them. In my 3 years here, I have not even been able to have a meeting with the UK representative to the UN. Again and again, we tried to set up meetings. We have tried to see people, to share these stories. And again and again and again, the door has remained shut. So what was the point of my role here? I honestly don't know. Because I have the stories. I have the experience. I wanted to be an advocate. But if the doors remain shut, I cannot fulfill my role.
Thank you, John.
Thank you. In the name of the UN Correspondent Association, thank you for the briefing. My name is Ibtisam Azim, Al-Arabi Al-Jadid newspaper. I have two questions. One thing regarding the issue of where do you believe that the press is also not doing the job they need to do? And then the other issue is the issue of language that you touched on. Language used, words like resilience and inspiration, despite the fact that it's true. Why do you think this is so often done instead of using other words that describe reality and talks about reality? Thank you.
You know, I think I'm a pragmatist in my approach to things. One of the beliefs that I have is that we cannot empower other people. And we hear many agencies talking about we empower women, we empower people with disabilities. Empowerment has to come from within. I went through my own experience of having to rebuild a life. I spent 1 year in hospital, 37 operations. When I started to use prosthetic legs again, nobody empowered me on those days when my legs were bleeding and bruised and painful. But I did have the best support network the best facilitators that enabled me to empower myself. And so when I set up my own organization, that's how I wanted to approach things. To look at things as barriers that are stopping people empowering themselves. So we have to stop looking at people with disabilities as victims. We have to stop looking at them with sympathy. I think we should look at them as assets. Because some of the most resilient people you will meet in the workforce are people with disabilities, people who have struggled their whole lives, people who have met those challenges. For me, resilience is life's gift for your suffering and challenges. It gives you strengths that enable you to be an amazing part of the workforce. There are barriers that stop those people. And so rather than look at them as the problem, we must always look at the societal barriers that are holding them back from achieving what they can. I remember when I first started this role, I spoke about a man I met in Cambodia. He had been injured as a child soldier during the time of the Khmer Rouge. He was about the same age as me. He had similar injuries. He'd lost both legs to a landmine. We met at a rehab center. He had never been given the support he needed, and because his amputations were above the knees, which make it more complicated, he'd never received the right prosthesis and physiotherapy. He eventually said, "Come and visit me where I live." Now, he lived with his sister. His sister lived in a very humble house. She was trying to support her family. She did what she could. This man was as strong as I think I am, certainly more intelligent than I am, resilient and desperate to work. But he was like me, around 50 years old at that point. And as I was leaving, he showed me 3 dog baskets that were under the side of the building, under a little bit of shelter. And he pointed at the biggest one and he said, "That is where I sleep." That man's no different to me, except he lives like a dog. Why? Because he didn't have the right support to enable him to empower himself to live a full life. And so that's all I'm saying we need to do, is to stop looking at people as victims. Also, we have to stop looking at people as inspiration. We simply have to look at people with disabilities as people whose society has put barriers up from stopping them achieving their goals. And we have to break those barriers down and allow them to empower themselves.
The press?
The first part, the press, and
I think I'm a storyteller. So for me, everything begins with the story. And stories mean listening and then sharing that person's experience. I think, again, too often, stories around disability are, to a certain extent, romanticized. It's great to hear about Paralympic athletes or somebody that's managed to walk to Everest missing 2 limbs. But this is not the reality for most people. Because, again, the people that are able to do those things have had their barriers taken down. So I think we have to tell those hard stories, those difficult stories, the stories of pain, of suffering, because that actually is the reality for most people living with disability. 16 to 17% of the world's population label themselves as having disability. The stories we hear are only about the ones that we feel comfortable listening to. Unfortunately, the stories that are uncomfortable are the ones we need to be telling.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Thank you, Aziz Rami for the Moroccan Press Agency.
Hi.
You said in the beginning that the system has failed. Can you elaborate on who do you mean by the system? Is it the large organizations like the United Nations, or is it the NGO, societies, governments? And
You just listed them for me, thank you. No, it's everything, it's systematic.
And what do you think that should have been done that was not?
As I say, it's systematic, and I don't want to pick any particular agency. I am part of it as well. I'm part of the problem. It goes all the way from governments, the UN, even agencies. I, as somebody with disability, am the CEO of an organization that doesn't just deal with disability. We deal with all kinds of communities rebuilding after conflict. And yet, how many times I go and have meetings in Geneva or here in New York with multiple agencies representing disability, and I see nobody in that room who has lived experience. We still live in the sense of the other. We hope, unfortunately it's not completely the case, but we hope, and we've seen some improvement in organizations dealing with women's issues that are now more led by women. But that has not happened in the world of disability. So until we have people with lived experience in those roles, we will always be fighting a losing battle.
Thank you. Any other questions? Any questions online? Yes, go ahead, and then I'll go get to you, Iftikhar.
Thank you. My name is Sean from China's
Hi.
Xinhua News Agency. In terms of empowerment of the disabled and breaking down the barriers, do you think technology and science can help? Like in China, we have kind of a system, kind of tool that when attached to the legs, older people can walk more freely with ease. This kind of like AI robotics, there's great potential, right? How do you think governments and the society, companies can work towards this direction?
You know, I remember saying to somebody when I got injured and lost my legs that this was a great time for it to happen. Because we live in a time where everything from like online shopping made it easier for me to get groceries delivered. I have 2 prosthetic legs that enable me to do many, many things. Adaptive technology is at a very exciting point, and it means that many people have opportunities. This is what I was talking about, though, with barriers. There are barriers in terms now of income. There are barriers of who has access to that adaptive technology. The way I see it is, you know, too often governments see people with disability as a burden. And therefore, it's something that they have to be looked after, but they're kept at a certain level. I see it the opposite way, and I see it that people with disability, as I mentioned earlier, are actually a huge asset. But that means an investment in those adaptive technologies to enable people to self-empower and get back to work. So I think, again, it's a mindset. It's a mindset thing of rather than looking at somebody with disability and feeling sorry and sympathy, but look and go, okay, what are the barriers? What's holding you back? What's stopping you getting back to work or achieving the things you want to do, and how can we help you to get to that point? And you know what? I say I'm a pragmatist. Economically, that often makes sense for countries. Because if you've got 16% of the population who sees themselves as having disability and a percentage that feels they're not even able to work or do the things they're able to do, if we can find ways to do that, and it should be more possible than ever, as you say, with new technologies, with adaptive technologies, with AI, but it's the mindset. It's the mindset, and also making sure that those are available to that man in Cambodia who lives like a dog, because the technology is there for him to be able to walk. I have it.
Thank you. Iftikhar, go ahead, we'll go online. Iftikhar, go ahead.
Thank you for your deeply moving presentation. Indeed, it was very touching. You, sir, are a true advocate. Now that you are leaving, my question has been partly answered, but what advice would you give to the person who follows you in this position?
Well, for a start, I don't think there is anybody following me in this position, as far as I'm aware, which also says something about the role. But I think whoever it is has to try their hardest to be exactly that, an advocate, and not to be used as inspiration. We are not here, as I say, as an advocate, to be talking about our life story to make other people feel better about their own. Yes, I can be inspiring. I'm happy to do that and talk about that. But in this role, we are here to share the stories of others. You know, often as a photographer and writer, people say, you give voice to others. I don't give voice to anybody. My job is simply to amplify the voices that they have already, the unheard. And all I would say is whoever takes this role, they have to fight harder than I did.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Islam?
Thank you very much. Islam Doğru from Anadolu Agency. You said you failed, but let me ask you other way around. In past 3 years, have you accomplished anything that you feel you should get credit? Thank you.
No, I wouldn't say anything I got credit. I'm lucky that my own organization, so the 3 stories that I reference, we were able to help at least 2 of those families and those communities by providing specialist wheelchairs, by providing the equipment that they need to be able to live a more full life with breaking down some of those barriers. So on a personal level, I've certainly, with my team, feel that we've achieved things. But in my role as advocate, I feel like I failed.
Giles, thank you
Thank
very
you.
much, and thanks for taking the time, and thank all of you. Take care.
Thank you.